By Friday afternoon, I had already spent 11 exhausting hours preparing for the biggest night of my career, a charity benefit at the historic Meridian Hall in Charleston, where more than 800 guests were expected to raise money for families facing homelessness and medical debt. But the message that appeared on my phone at 3:16 p.m. made every achievement suddenly feel strangely small. Don't come to Sunday dinner, Claire. Grandma wants the whole family there, and with Daniel Whitmore attending, we need to keep things simple. Daniel wasn't just some wealthy guest or distant acquaintance. He was the newly elected mayor of the city, a man whose support could determine whether our organization received a major public-private grant. And the painful part was that my family knew exactly who he was because my younger brother, Ethan, had been dating his daughter for almost a year. I read the message twice before locking my phone and sliding it beneath a stack of printed programs. Because after 15 years of being the daughter nobody mentioned when guests asked about the family, I had finally stopped expecting an invitation to matter. Yet what my relatives didn't know was that Sunday dinner wasn't the only place Daniel Whitmore would be seeing me that weekend, since he had personally agreed to present the first-ever Community Courage Award at my event that evening. When my operations manager, Sophia Ramirez, noticed my expression, she asked if something had happened, and I simply said, "Apparently my family has decided I'm too complicated for dinner," before forcing a smile and adding, "Good thing I have somewhere else to be." 5:30, Meridian Hall looked nothing like the dusty theater I had first walked into years earlier, because the chandeliers had been polished. Hundreds of candles flickered along the staircase. Volunteers moved between tables carrying silver place cards, and a massive screen displayed photographs of families who had received emergency housing through the foundation I had built from a borrowed office and a second-hand laptop. I stood backstage reviewing the final schedule when Sophia handed me a folder and said, "One more thing, you've been moved to the main table." And I laughed softly because I had spent years making sure everyone else was comfortable while quietly accepting whatever seat remained for me, never imagining that one day the most important table in the room would have my name printed in gold. At 6:12, while I was checking the microphone levels, I heard familiar voices drifting through the side entrance, and when I glanced through the curtain, I saw my mother, father, brother Ethan, and several cousins arriving for a private reception that had been scheduled in the adjoining garden room before their own Sunday trip, apparently using the same venue for a political fundraiser connected to Daniel's family. My father's voice carried clearly through the corridor when he said, "Remember, Ethan, don't bring up Claire tonight unless someone asks," followed by my mother's nervous whisper, "We just want everything to look respectable." And for a moment I felt that old ache return, but instead of hiding, I straightened my jacket, stepped back into the ballroom, and decided that whatever happened next, I would not make myself smaller to fit inside their expectations. 20 minutes later, Daniel Whitmore arrived with his wife and 2 staff members, and instead of heading toward the private reception, he walked directly toward me with a broad smile, shook my hand, and said, "Claire Bennett, I finally get to meet the person everyone at City Hall keeps talking about," which made Sophia grin from behind me. I welcomed him and explained the evening's program, but before he could continue, Ethan approached with an awkward smile and said, "Mayor Whitmore, this is my sister Claire," expecting perhaps the casual introduction to end there, only for Daniel to reply, "Your sister? She's the woman who convinced my office to keep emergency housing open through the winter," and Ethan's confident expression immediately disappeared. My father had been standing several feet away, and I watched his face change as he realized that the daughter he had described as always chasing little nonprofit projects was not an unknown volunteer, but the founder and executive director responsible for a program his own political contacts had publicly praised. He walked toward us slowly and said, "Claire, why didn't you tell us you were working with the mayor?" And I answered calmly, "Because you never asked," while Daniel glanced between us with the uncomfortable awareness of someone who had just walked into a family story nobody had explained. And before my father could respond, the event coordinator announced that the doors were opening and hundreds of guests began filling the hall. The evening moved quickly, with musicians playing softly beneath the balcony, local business owners greeting one another, journalists photographing the stage, and donors placing pledge cards into crystal boxes. But the moment that changed everything came when the mayor stepped behind the podium and looked directly at me before saying, "Tonight isn't about politicians, celebrities, or people whose names appear in newspapers. It's about the person who stayed when everyone else went home." And as photographs appeared behind him showing families receiving keys to temporary apartments, children entering warm classrooms, and volunteers delivering meals during winter storms, he explained that Claire Bennett had personally negotiated with hospitals, landlords, and city agencies until thousands of vulnerable residents had somewhere safe to sleep. I could feel my mother's eyes on me from the back of the room, and when I looked toward my family, my brother Ethan appeared genuinely stunned, while my father sat completely still with his hands folded over his program. But I didn't feel victorious because the truth was more complicated than that. I had spent years hoping that one day they would recognize me, and now that hundreds of strangers were applauding the very work they had dismissed, I discovered that recognition from people who had refused to see me couldn't repair everything that had happened before. Then Daniel surprised everyone by announcing that his office had reviewed the foundation's expansion proposal, and that the city would commit matching funds if the private donors approved the final campaign target that night, causing the room to erupt as the total on the giant screen climbed from $1.8 million to $2.4 million, then $2.9 million, and finally just over $3.1 million. Sophia grabbed my hand backstage with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You realize what this means, don't you?" And I nodded because for the first time I understood that the years of rejected proposals, sleepless nights, and tiny victories had become something much larger than a family argument. It had become a future for people who desperately needed one. After the applause faded, my father approached me near the staircase, away from the cameras, and for several seconds neither of us spoke until he finally said, "I was wrong about you." And I looked at him, not with anger but with the tired honesty of someone who had waited a long time to hear those words. He admitted that he had mistaken my quietness for failure because I never bragged about my work, and I replied, "Dad, I didn't need you to brag about me. I just needed you to stop being ashamed of what I chose to do." And his eyes lowered as he realized that the problem had never been that I lacked success. It was that he had never taken the time to understand what success meant to me. Before leaving, my mother hugged me and whispered that she hoped I would still come to Sunday dinner, but I smiled and told her, "Maybe someday, when I'm invited because I'm your daughter instead of because someone important will be there." And when I stepped outside into the cool Charleston evening, I saw the city lights reflecting across the river, while hundreds of people were still inside celebrating a cause that had once existed only as an idea in my tiny apartment. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sophia saying, "The board wants you to lead the expansion personally." And I smiled because suddenly the rejection that had hurt so badly that afternoon felt less like a door closing and more like life, finally pushing me toward a room where I belonged. The next morning, I didn't attend the family dinner, and I didn't send an angry explanation or demand an apology, because I had learned that sometimes the strongest response to being underestimated is simply to keep building something nobody can dismiss. As I walked into the foundation's new office and watched volunteers prepare welcome packets for families who would soon receive housing assistance, I thought about my father's words, my mother's hesitation, the mayor's speech, and the lonely years that had brought me there. Then I opened my laptop and began planning the next campaign, because my story was no longer about proving my worth to a family that had failed to see it. It was about using every difficult chapter to create a better future for people who needed someone willing to see them. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.